In the winter skies over Western Europe in 1943, there was a moment every B-17 crewman feared more than flak, more than mid-air collisions, more than the bitter cold that froze oxygen masks and turned bare skin black. It was the moment when the call would come over the interphone, calm, clipped, inevitable. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. A simple sentence, delivered in a tone that pretended not to tremble. But every man who heard it knew what was coming. German fighters, Bf-109s and FW-190s, diving in perfect formation straight at the nose of the bomber, guns blazing from the front, where the B-17 flying fortress was least protected. The attack window lasted only 2 or 3 seconds, but in those seconds, entire crews vanished. Pilots were decapitated, noses were ripped open, bombardiers were killed before they ever saw the enemy. The B-17 was famous for surviving catastrophic damage, but it had one flaw that the Luftwaffe exploited again and again: a weak, almost undefended forward arc. The flying fortress could spit fire in every direction, except the one the Germans used most. In early 1943, 40% of all B-17 losses in the 8th Air Force came from the same attack vector, frontal assaults, not from flak, not from tail chases, not from side attacks, just head-on runs from well-trained German aces, who understood that hitting a bomber from 12 o'clock meant they closed distance so fast the gunners barely had time to react. The B-17's 30 cal nose guns could not track quickly enough. The bomber's own 50 cal batteries couldn't cover the gap. A bomber stream might have 100 guns firing, but all of them were blind directly forward. When the formation crossed into German airspace, every crewman knew that the first few minutes of intercept, before escorts could help, were a gauntlet of incoming cannon fire, and the U.S. Army Air Forces needed a solution quickly because the daylight bombing strategy of combat box formations wasn't sustainable. Even after the introduction of staggered cells, even after increasing the density of fire, bomber crews were still dying by the dozens on missions over Bremen, Schweinfurt, and the Ruhr. So, the Air Force tried something bold, almost desperate. Build a B-17 that could escort other B-17s. A flying fortress turned into a flying guard dog. A heavy escort bomber. A machine that carried so many guns, so much ammunition, and so much armor that it could tear apart German fighters before they ever reached the formation. It was called the YB-40, and it was one of the most spectacular failures of the entire war. But like every spectacular failure in wartime, it carried inside it a tiny spark of brilliance. Something small, something dismissed, something almost accidental. Something that would end up saving thousands of lives. The U.S. Army Air Forces would spend $5.6 million on a program that produced a plane too heavy to keep up with the bombers it was built to protect. But buried in that failure was a single innovation, a turret. A simple, elegant, electrically powered turret that fixed the exact problem the B-17 had been suffering from since the first day it flew over Europe. This is the story of how a failed escort bomber, a rejected weapons platform, a dead-end project the Air Corps tried to bury, ended up cutting frontal losses by 71%, reshaping bomber warfare, and saving 2,300 B-17 crewmen who would otherwise have died in the cold skies above Europe. But before the turret, before the YB-40 disaster, before the generals admitted their mistake, there were the crews, men in bulky flight suits, men wiping frost from the perspex windows, men tightening oxygen mask straps with trembling hands. Men like Sergeant Edward Holling, a nose gunner on a B-17F named Georgia Peach, who described the feeling of seeing German fighters coming head-on. It's like a train coming through your living room. You can see the pilot, you can see the fire from his guns, and for 2 or 3 seconds, you can't do a damn thing except pray. Or Lieutenant Mark Bolton, a co-pilot from the 96th Bomb Group, who watched a frontal attack kill 3 men in his nose compartment so instantly that they never even slumped over, just froze in place, lifeless, as the wind ripped through the holes where the glass had been. For bomber crews, the math was simple and terrifying. If the Germans came head-on, someone was going to die. Head-on attacks became so effective that the Luftwaffe taught them systematically. German pilots called it Die Hammer Methode, the hammer method. It was a brutal, direct punch straight into the only weak spot the flying fortress had. U.S. commanders knew something had to be done, but the fix wasn't obvious. More guns meant more weight. More weight meant slower climb rates. Slower climb rates meant formations spread apart, and formations that weren't tight enough invited even more attacks. It was a vicious loop. This was the environment into which the YB-40 was born. An aircraft almost comically overloaded with guns, twin 50s in the nose, twin 50s in the top turret, twin 50s in the waist, twin 50s in the tail, twin 50s in a new dorsal twin stagger position, extra ammo boxes stacked along the floor, thick armor plates welded everywhere a gunner might stand. It was a fortress inside a fortress. On paper, it made sense. In the air, it was a disaster. The YB-40 was too heavy to keep formation after the bombers dropped their payloads. It lagged behind, unable to climb or accelerate. Bomber crews started calling it the orphan because it was always left behind. The Luftwaffe started calling it the gift because they could easily isolate it. But then, something unexpected. Inside the mountain of modifications, one tiny system worked beautifully. The Bendix electric chin turret. A clean, smooth, stabilized, pilot-controlled turret mounted under the nose of the bomber, swiveling like an owl's head, tracking targets with electric precision. It was the one part of the YB-40 that wasn't a failure. In fact, it was genius, and it was about to change everything the B-17 did in the skies over Germany. The Bendix chin turret didn't look like the kind of invention that would change the fortunes of bomber crews across Europe. It wasn't huge or imposing like the dorsal turret. It didn't bristle with barrels like the waist guns. It was small, compact, and tucked neatly beneath the nose, almost modest. But inside that modest shape was a level of engineering elegance the rest of the bomber world hadn't caught up to yet. Unlike the clunky, hand-cranked nose guns of earlier B-17Fs, the Bendix turret was electrically powered, gyro-stabilized, and capable of precise, fingertip-controlled movement. It responded instantly to small joystick inputs. It could track fighters approaching at over 300 miles per hour, and, crucially, it gave the bomber a true forward-facing wall of 50 cal fire for the first time in its life. Before it, nose gunners had to manhandle flexible guns, trying to swing them fast enough to chase fighters diving straight at them. The guns vibrated, the glass got in the way, and every adjustment meant losing precious fractions of a second. With the Bendix turret, all of that changed. It wasn't just an upgrade, it was a transformation. Suddenly, German pilots found themselves flying directly into two perfectly stabilized 50 cal Brownings that could fire at full rate of fire without shaking the nose apart. Suddenly, the B-17 could fight back at the exact angle where it had always been naked. But the turret alone wasn't enough to save the YB-40. Nothing could save the YB-40. It was too heavy, too slow, and too far outside its design envelope. The turret's brilliance was drowned out by the rest of the aircraft's failings. Failed missions, failed formations, failed escorts. After a short operational trial in 1943, the YB-40 program was quietly shut down. The planes were scrapped. The units were reassigned. The project was marked ineffective, no further production. The Air Force moved on, or at least it thought it had, because buried in the pages of the YB-40 test reports, past the complaints about climb rate and fuel load and weight penalties, was one observation repeated again and again by combat crews, engineers, and evaluators. The forward turret performed exceptionally. Nose defense improved dramatically. Recommend integration into standard B-17 fleet. It was rare for test pilots to speak so unanimously. Rarer still for bomber crews, who were notoriously hard to impress, and the data backed them up. During YB-40 trial sorties, German frontal attacks were noticeably less successful. Several Luftwaffe pilots reported aborting their head-on runs entirely when they saw the turret tracking them. The Air Corps couldn't afford to ignore that, not with bomber losses climbing to unsustainable numbers. Not when the very strategy of daylight precision bombing depended on keeping the formations intact long enough to reach the target. So, in late 1943, the Bendix chin turret was quietly removed from the pile of YB-40 scrap ideas and ordered into full production. It became the defining visual signature of the next major variant of the bomber, the B-17G. The G model wasn't just an incremental upgrade, it was the perfected flying fortress, the aircraft the designers would have built from the beginning if they'd known how brutal German frontal attacks would become. And at the heart of that perfection sat the little Bendix turret, humming with electric motors, waiting for the moment when it would change the outcome of entire air battles. When the first B-17Gs arrived in Europe, the crews were skeptical. They had seen so many fixes come and go. Strips of armor, awkward gun mounts, makeshift plexiglass patches, emergency field mods welded in muddy English airfields. But one mission changed all of that. Over Bremen, a formation of B-17Gs encountered a wave of Bf-109Gs, attempting the classic head-on slash. It was a tactic that had worked flawlessly for months. But this time, the German fighters met something new, a turret that could track them from over a mile away. The first 109 came in fast, too fast. He dove from 12 o'clock high, nose down, cannons ready. He expected the usual snap of nose guns that couldn't follow him. Instead, he saw bright flashes erupting from a rotating turret that stayed locked on him like a predator's eyes. His wings flicked right. The turret followed. He jinked left. The turret matched him. And then the 50 cals opened up. The fighter disintegrated before it ever reached firing distance. The second pilot tried a shallow approach instead of a dive. He met the same fate. 2 brief flashes from the chin turret, a puff of smoke from his engine, and then a trail of debris spinning toward the ground. The third pilot aborted entirely. He banked away hard, refusing to charge a bomber that could now stare him down with electric precision. That day, the crews returned home with something they hadn't brought with them in a long time: confidence in the nose. In after-action reports, bombardiers described the turret as a game-changer, a lifesaver, and the first time the B-17 could actually defend itself up front. German intelligence picked up on it almost immediately. The Luftwaffe quickly circulated warnings about the new forward cannon system on American bombers, overestimating its power but accurately describing its deadliness. The change didn't take weeks or months to show in the data. It showed instantly. Frontal losses dropped, and not by a little. They dropped by 71%. For the first time, daylight bombing seemed like something other than mass sacrifice. The 8th Air Force ran the numbers. Target commanders ran them again. Analysts recalculated, double-checked, triple-checked, because no one believed the results at first. But the math didn't lie. Missions that previously cost 10, 12, 15 bombers now saw only 3 or 4 hit by frontal attacks, and some saw none at all. And the impact wasn't just tactical. It was emotional, psychological. Bomber crews began climbing into their aircraft with a new sense of survivability. The sky wasn't safe, not yet, not by a long shot, but the most terrifying attack known to them had suddenly become something they could fight. And all of this, every life saved, every aircraft that limped back to England instead of flaming out over the Channel, every bombardier who lived long enough to see the war's end, all of it came from a turret that wasn't supposed to survive the cancellation of a failed escort bomber. All of it came from the ashes of a $5.6 million mistake. The irony of the Bendix chin turret's success is that almost no one outside the Air Corps ever heard about the YB-40 again. The YB-40 airframes were quietly retired to training fields or scrapped. Photographs were filed away. Reports were pushed into archives. To the public, it simply vanished. But for the men who flew the B-17G, the turret was a lifeline. It meant the difference between coming home or disappearing into a column of smoke someplace over Europe. One crewman from the 388th Bomb Group later said that the first time he saw a B-17G roll past him on the taxiway, it looked like the plane had grown a chin. Another gunner joked that the aircraft now looked mean, like it was smiling with its teeth bared. But beneath the jokes lay a real sense of relief, a feeling that someone, somewhere, had finally listened. There was a shift in morale across the 8th Air Force, small at first, almost fragile, but real. Men began standing a little straighter during pre-flight briefings. The airfields, usually quiet with tension before a big mission, buzzed with a cautious optimism. Pilots who once dreaded the moment when the formation turned toward enemy territory now felt they had a chance. Not safety, no one believed in safety, but a chance. And that shift couldn't have come at a more important time. By late 1943, the Allied bombing campaign against Germany was reaching a breaking point. Losses during the Second Schweinfurt raid were catastrophic. 60 B-17s shot down in a single day. Hundreds of crewmen were killed or taken prisoner. For the first time, commanders openly questioned whether daylight precision bombing was sustainable. Some argued that the campaign should be halted until long-range escorts were ready. Others believed the entire doctrine had been wrong from the start. But then, the new B-17Gs began entering service in significant numbers. They didn't solve every problem. Escort fighters were still lacking. The Luftwaffe remained a formidable force, and the flak over Germany grew thicker every month. But the B-17G did something nothing else had managed. It stabilized the front line in the sky. It plugged the fatal gap. It made the daylight offensive survivable long enough for the P-51 Mustang to arrive and change the balance permanently. The B-17G and the Mustang became partners in the same story. The turret kept the bombers alive long enough for the fighters to reach them. And once the Mustangs had the range to escort the formations all the way to Berlin and back, the tide of the air war turned for good. German pilots noticed the difference right away. The first time a group of FW-190 pilots encountered a full box of B-17Gs, they described the experience in stark terms. It was like charging into a wall. Their head-on attacks, once their most reliable tactic, suddenly became the most dangerous. The chin turret didn't just fire, it tracked, smoothly, predictably, lethally. One German pilot, interviewed after the war, said, "Before the chin turret, we would close from the front without fear. After the turret arrived, the first attack often became the last." Another pilot claimed that he could tell at a distance whether a bomber was an older F model or a new G model. If he saw the turret, he simply broke away and regrouped. This wasn't arrogance, it was self-preservation. The Luftwaffe had always relied on frontal attacks because they compressed the engagement window. German fighters could strike a formation, fire at extreme speed, and dive away before the American gunners could react. The chin turret stole that advantage from them. Suddenly, the Americans reacted instantly. The turret gave the bombardier, usually the man with the best forward view, an active defensive weapon. The nose was no longer a weakness, it was a trap. One bombardier from the 303rd Bomb Group described the first time he engaged the turret in combat. He said it felt like, "God handed me a steering wheel for the sun." The turret flowed so smoothly under his fingertips that it almost felt alive. And when he fired, he didn't feel the vibration that used to shake the flexible guns. He felt stability, precision, control. Three things extremely rare in a B-17 fighting for its life. Not every attack was a clean victory. There were still losses, still collisions, still engines blown apart by cannon fire. But the scale changed. The hemorrhaging stopped. A mission that might once have cost 12 bombers now cost 3. A raid that might once have been labeled a disaster became merely costly. And costly was survivable. Survivable meant repeatable. Repeatable meant strategic pressure. Strategic pressure meant Germany's war machine began to crack. The 8th Air Force knew exactly what the turret was worth. In internal evaluations, analysts estimated that 2,300 B-17 crewmen survived missions they would have otherwise died on. That number wasn't an exaggeration. It came from tallying saved aircraft, intercepted fighters, missed head-on passes, and comparative loss rates between F models and G models. The chin turret wasn't a footnote. It was a revolution. And yet, for all its impact, its origin story remained tangled inside the wreckage of the YB-40. A plane the Air Corps didn't want to talk about. A project that embarrassed engineers and frustrated commanders. But the truth is that progress rarely emerges cleanly. Almost every wartime innovation is born from failure, sometimes colossal failure, sometimes expensive failure. The key is whether someone has the humility to salvage the one part that worked. The YB-40 was a disaster, but the turret was a masterpiece. It did something even the most advanced escort fighters of the era couldn't do. It protected the bomber at its most vulnerable moment, the brief window before escorts arrived, before the formation stabilized, before altitude was gained. The turret didn't replace fighters, but it bought time. And in the air war over Europe, time was life. Crews who flew both B-17F and B-17G models often described the difference in emotional terms rather than technical ones. They said the G model felt safer, looked tougher, and acted more like a fighting machine than a flying target. Some claimed they could sense enemy hesitation the moment the chin turrets began to swivel, as if the German pilots recognized the danger instantly. And they were right. They did. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's frontline units were beginning to avoid frontal attacks altogether against formations with G models. They shifted tactics to side attacks, slashing from 3 or 9 o'clock, or climbing above the bomber streams to attack from the rear. But even these tactics became harder to execute once the Mustangs arrived. By the time long-range escort was fully operational, the combination of P-51s and B-17Gs had fundamentally changed the air war, and all because of a turret born from a failed experiment. The introduction of the B-17G did more than reduce losses and restore confidence. It fundamentally reshaped how bomber crews thought about themselves and their relationship to the war. Before the Chin turret, many crews felt they were participating in a strategy that treated them like expendable pieces of a giant machine. The daylight bombing doctrine demanded precision, and precision demanded flying straight, steady, and predictable. Perfect targets in a sky filled with predators. You couldn't maneuver, you couldn't scatter, you couldn't break formation to survive. You stayed in the box, no matter what was coming toward you. And when German fighters came head-on, every instinct in a pilot's body screamed to duck, juke, or dive, anything to break the collision course. But the rules forbade that. The entire system of bombardment depended on discipline, cohesion, geometry. The bombers weren't just aircraft, they were nodes in a grid, parts of a lattice that produced accurate fire, even through wind, cloud, and enemy resistance. That rigidity cost lives. So when a defensive upgrade came along that didn't disrupt formation integrity, didn't add new doctrine, didn't require new tactics, it was a revelation. The Chin turret fit seamlessly into the existing system. It didn't require retraining thousands of men. It didn't demand rewiring the doctrine. It simply gave the grid more teeth. For the first time, a bomber box wasn't just a geometric pattern. It was a fortress worthy of the name. One crew chief described the feeling of watching a fully armed B-17G taxi out for the first time. It looked like a lion after someone finally gave it claws in the front. Another ground crewman recalled the strange mixture of awe and comfort he felt when touching the turret's smooth armored housing during pre-flight. It felt like hope, he said. Cold, heavy hope. In many ways, the turret arrived at a symbolic moment. The air war was entering a phase of escalation. Germany was producing new fighters with heavier armament. Their pilots were becoming more aggressive, more willing to press home lethal attacks. The Americans were preparing for deeper penetration raids, Berlin, Leipzig, Regensburg, and beyond. And the losses were still too high to sustain that offensive. The Chin turret didn't win the war alone, but it closed one of the open wounds in the bomber force. It gave American crews a fighting chance during the most lethal seconds of combat. And those seconds, tiny flashes of time barely long enough to blink, were the difference between returning to England or vanishing into the snowy fields of Saxony. As the G model became the new standard, the impact rippled outward. Maintenance crews adapted to the system quickly. Bombardiers trained to become dual-role operators, precision bomb aimers, and now precision gunners. And pilots learned how to coordinate their movements so the turret had the clearest possible field of fire during the approach to the target. Some commanders even began adjusting their formation geometry subtly to take advantage of overlapping Chin turret coverage. The bomber stream gained a new layer of forward-facing firepower, a mesh of arcs and zones that made frontal attacks increasingly suicidal for German fighters. The Luftwaffe, recognizing this shift, began altering its tactics. Instead of the classic 12 o'clock dive, some pilots attempted shallow offset attacks, approaches from 1 or 2 o'clock, or from 11 o'clock at high speed. But these angles were less efficient, less stable, and far more dangerous. Others tried high-side attacks from above, rolling in from the sun. But the dorsal turrets and tail gunners were already trained for those angles, and the P-47s and P-51s increasingly intercepted the high passes. Slowly, methodically, the air war tilted, and the turning point was measurable, mathematically undeniable. A 71% reduction in frontal losses, thousands of men alive who otherwise would have disappeared. It didn't take long for B-17G crews to begin developing their own micro-tactics with the turret. Bombardiers spoke to each other over the interphone, sharing tips, tracking angles, calling out patterns. Some learned to anticipate the timing of German dives, firing preemptive bursts that forced enemy pilots to brake early. Others mastered the art of painting the sky in front of the bomber with a curtain of fire, an invisible barrier of lead that no fighter could pass through without paying for it. But the turret's value wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Fear was the silent enemy in every bomber crew. The knowledge that a frontal attack might be the last thing you ever saw weighed heavily on the mind. Men slept poorly. Some developed shaking hands before missions. Others vomited on the hard stand before climbing aboard the aircraft. Crewmen described the frontal attacks with phrases like, "the doorway to hell," and "the 3 seconds that last forever." These weren't exaggerations. They were the lived experience of men trapped in a tunnel of incoming death, unable to maneuver, forced to stare straight into the guns of an approaching fighter. But the chin turret broke that psychological stranglehold. It gave the crew agency, a new weapon, a new tool, a way to fight back, something to do other than pray. One bombardier from the 95th Bomb Group recalled how the turret changed his entire relationship with fear. "Before the chin turret, I felt like a passenger waiting to be shot," he said. "After the turret, I felt like a man with a job. Fear shrinks when you can fight." And that psychological resilience mattered. Bombing missions were marathons of endurance, hours of monotony followed by minutes of terror, followed by more hours limping home on damaged engines or shredded control surfaces. The crews couldn't afford to be mentally broken before they even reached the target. The turret didn't eliminate fear, but it gave the fear somewhere to go, somewhere to funnel into action. And the results echoed through the 8th Air Force. G-model crews survived more missions. Higher survival meant more experience. More experience meant better accuracy. Better accuracy meant more damage to German industry. More damage meant fewer enemy fighters in the sky. A self-reinforcing cycle, built on a single turret. To German commanders, the shift was alarming. Reports from frontline fighter groups began noting increased difficulty approaching bomber formations. Losses mounted. Head-on attacks, once the Luftwaffe's most feared weapon, became less and less viable. The survival rate for German pilots plummeted. Training schools couldn't replace them fast enough. The head-on attack was dying, not because the Germans forgot how to execute it, but because American engineers had unknowingly built a machine that punished it relentlessly. And the men in the B-17Gs noticed. Mission by mission, sortie by sortie, they watched the Luftwaffe adapt, flinch, hesitate. The change was subtle, but real. Enemy fighters breaking off earlier, attacking from less deadly angles, or sometimes not attacking at all. And behind that shift, behind every surviving bomber, behind every formation that made it home, sat the turret that wasn't supposed to exist. The turret rescued from a failed escort bomber. The turret that survived when everything around it had been written off. The deeper the war pressed into 1944, the more the B-17G and its chin turret became inseparable from the identity of the 8th Air Force. Airfields across England filled with rows of gleaming fortresses sporting the new low-slung turret, each one a subtle reminder that the bomber force had survived a crucible and emerged sharper, deadlier, more mature. Ground crews, who once spent every free minute repairing shredded nose sections on B-17F models, suddenly saw their workload shift. There were still holes to patch, engines to tend, and flak damage to weld. But the catastrophic forward destruction that once characterized every major raid began to recede into memory. Veteran crews noticed it first. The men who had flown F models through Schweinfurt, Bremen, and Kiel, the ones who had watched friends vaporized by 20mm cannon shells, began to realize that their missions on G models didn't feel like suicide runs anymore. Close? Yes. Dangerous? Always. But there was no longer the sense of inevitability when German fighters turned to line up their approach. The G model held its chin up and stared back. The psychological shift was profound. Bombardiers who once knelt behind a sheet of glass, waiting for death to arrive at 300 miles per hour, now gripped a control yoke that responded to their slightest intention. They weren't watching helplessly anymore. They were hunting. They were participating. They were shaping the outcome rather than enduring it. The stories spread through the airfields like folklore. One bombardier from the 381st Bomb Group claimed he could smell fear from the German pilots the moment his chin turret began to track them. He said that more than once he fired a short burst, not to kill but to warn, and watched entire fighter elements peel away. Another gunner, newly transitioned to a G model, said the turret felt like having a guard dog in my lap. These were emotional metaphors, yes, but they reflected a real shift in power dynamics. The men flying the missions weren't the only ones who noticed. German intelligence units began compiling reports on the new nose cannon mounted on American bombers. They knew it wasn't a cannon, and yet the perception alone told its own story. Enemy pilots believed American bombers were now too dangerous to face head-on. And in air combat, belief is often more decisive than firepower. Yet still, the turret's origin remained largely unknown among the men whose lives it protected. Only a small group of officers and engineers remembered that this life-saving device came not from a successful program, but from a failed idea. An escort bomber that couldn't escort, a weapons platform that couldn't keep up, a project that swallowed millions of wartime dollars before collapsing under its own weight. The YB-40 might have been a failure as an airplane, but as a laboratory, as a rough draft of innovation, it was one of the most valuable testbeds the Air Corps ever built. And so the war continued, mission after mission, each one carving the story of the turret deeper into the steel sky above Europe. As the Allies pushed into 1944, the bombing campaign shifted from punishing German industry to systematically dismantling the Luftwaffe itself. Fuel refineries burned, aircraft assembly plants were shattered, runways were cratered day after day. And through all of it, the G models marched forward, engines roaring, nose turrets swiveling, guns ready. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots faster than it could train replacements. Veteran fighter aces, men who had mastered the brutal art of head-on passes, were being replaced by barely trained cadets. Many of them were terrified of the chin turret before they even took off. They had heard stories. They had seen gun camera footage. Some had witnessed the consequences firsthand. A friend's plane disintegrating in a clean line of 50 cal strikes. The Luftwaffe's answer was desperation. Rammings, rocket attacks, massed formations of fighters. But nothing restored the effectiveness of the frontal assault. That chapter was closed. Meanwhile, the B-17 crews grew more confident, more experienced, more deadly. They understood how to use the turret's visibility to their advantage. They learned to time their bursts. They learned to coordinate with other bombardiers. They learned that German pilots, once fearless, now often hesitated just long enough for them to take the shot. A single second of hesitation in a head-on pass is fatal. One bomber crew described an engagement over Merseburg, where a group of Bf-109s attempted a frontal attack, but flinched, just slightly, when they saw the nose turrets tracking them. That hesitation threw off their timing. Instead of a synchronized attack, the fighters staggered unevenly, presenting themselves as single targets rather than a unified strike. The chin turrets tore them apart. On another mission, a bombardier from the 388th Bomb Group recalled firing a burst that forced a fighter to abort its charge, only to watch it collide with another German plane attempting to continue the pass. It was like they forgot how to do it, he said later, but they hadn't forgotten. The threat had changed. The sky was no longer theirs. The success of the turret echoed beyond the immediate tactical realm. It influenced engineering decisions for future aircraft, including tests of advanced fire control systems and power-driven turrets for other bombers. Engineers began to understand that strategic aircraft needed greater forward protection, not just from fighters, but from interceptors, rockets, and even early missiles. The philosophy of the chin turret, precise, stable, electrically controlled, foreshadowed the gun systems that would appear decades later on aircraft like the B-52, the AC-130, and even advanced drones. But in 1944, all of that was still in the future. For now, the turret was simply a guardian angel perched beneath the chin of every G model, watching the sky with cold, electric patience. Crews named them. They painted them. Some even talked to them. One bombardier swore he could feel when the turret was locked onto a target. Another claimed that the motors had a distinct hum he could sense in his bones. Whether these were superstitions or genuine observations hardly mattered. The men needed something to believe in. The turret gave them that. Something mechanical, something reliable, something that fought back. In a war where morale was as fragile as aluminum skin, that meant everything. And so the chin turret continued its silent work, mission after mission, protecting the heart of the bomber stream, giving crews seconds they had never had before, narrowing the margin of death just enough for survival. It did not roar. It did not shine. It did not dominate the airfields with size or noise. It simply turned. and tracked, and fired, and saved lives. By the time the calendar flipped to late 1944, the B-17G was no longer just an aircraft, it was an institution. It stood on English hardstands like giant metal guardians, each one with the signature turret hanging from its chin like a clenched fist. For new crews just arriving from stateside training, the sight felt reassuring. For veterans who had flown the older F models, it felt miraculous. Crews who had survived the worst raids, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, the Ruhr, often gathered the rookies around a G model and placed a hand on the turret's housing the way someone might touch a relic in a cathedral. They told stories about their friends who had died in the nose of earlier aircraft. They pointed to the turret and said, with a certainty that bordered on reverence, "This thing right here, this is why you might live." But the turret's impact was not confined to the airfields of England. Far away, in briefing rooms and command bunkers, planners at the 8th Air Force headquarters analyzed data from hundreds of missions. What they saw was astonishing. Frontal attack losses had collapsed. Crews were surviving at rates that would have been unthinkable 1 year earlier. And the Luftwaffe was showing clear signs of tactical breakdown. In a classified report circulated in December 1944, analysts noted that German pilots had begun avoiding head-on attacks altogether, except in rare circumstances. When they did attempt a frontal pass, it tended to be sloppy, hesitant, or poorly timed. Veteran German pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and the new recruits did not have the nerve or the skill to push through a storm of 50 caliber fire. It was a collapse of doctrine, a full-blown tactical extinction event. One German pilot, interviewed after the war, described the psychological shift in blunt terms. "We used to say the B-17F was a fortress," he explained. "But the B-17G," he paused, searching for the right word. "It was a cave with a dragon inside." He wasn't exaggerating. The chin turret fundamentally changed the geometry of the air battle. It extended the forward kill zone. It forced German fighters to approach from suboptimal angles. It disrupted timing. It introduced chaos into attacks that had once been ruthlessly efficient. And it did all of this without weighing down the bomber, slowing it down, or altering its flight characteristics dramatically. But it hadn't always been like that. Before the turret, bomber crews had lived under the shadow of predictable patterns of failure. They knew where they were vulnerable. They knew that once the fighters lined up for a frontal attack, their only defense was luck, timing, or the hope that another bomber's guns could catch the enemy first. They lived inside a statistical death trap. The chin turret broke the pattern. It rewrote the math. And as losses dropped, something began to happen inside the bomber crews themselves. Experience accumulated. Veteran crews who survived multiple missions gained a deeper understanding of formation discipline. They learned how to maintain spacing, how to coordinate with other aircraft, how to compute deflection shots instinctively, how to read enemy intentions by the angle of a wing or the flicker of a shadow. And those veterans taught the rookies. High losses had made this impossible in earlier years. Experience died with the men. But now, with survivability rising, institutional knowledge finally had a chance to take root. The chin turret wasn't the only reason crews survived, but it was the tool that bought them the time they needed to become masters of their craft. By early 1945, the B-17G formations felt different, sharper, colder, more disciplined. They no longer looked like clusters of individual airplanes. They looked like a single organism, a flying phalanx, each turret covering a specific arc, each aircraft part of a larger design. And at the very tip of that phalanx, like a spearhead, was the chin turret. The veterans joked that the G model didn't just shoot fighters, it scared them into making mistakes. Crews collected stories of enemy pilots who hesitated, pulled up too soon, flinched at the last second, or misjudged their approach angle because they feared the turret's steady electric gaze. One bomber group commander described it in his mission diary. "Before the chin turret, the Germans hunted us. After the chin turret, they stalked us. There's a difference." The difference was hesitation. Hesitation is fatal in air combat. Luftwaffe pilot trainees, rushed through accelerated flight programs, were warned repeatedly about the nose guns on American bombers. Some instructors exaggerated the turret's power, turning it into a kind of boogeyman. But fear has a way of becoming reality. An intimidated pilot was a bad pilot. A bad pilot was a dead pilot. The psychological toll on German fighter units was enormous. Their leaders recognized it, but could do little to stop it. It wasn't just the turret, it was fuel shortages, lack of training, engine failures, and overwhelming Allied numbers. But the turret represented a shift in the bombers' ability to fight back, at the exact angle the Germans relied on most. The ripple effect spread even further. With frontal losses plummeting, the 8th Air Force could redirect resources, pilots, aircraft, support crews, toward the strategic offensive rather than constant replacement. Commanders gained flexibility. Mission planners had more confidence in deep penetration raids. Targets once considered too dangerous, synthetic fuel plants, critical infrastructure, transportation hubs, were placed back on the list. The entire air war became more sustainable, all because the B-17 finally learned to fight forward. Meanwhile, the engineers who had designed the turret received little attention. They didn't seek fame. They didn't publish memoirs. They didn't carve their names into the fuselage. Most of them worked quietly at Bendix or at Army Air Corps labs, solving mechanical problems with electrical motors and gearing systems. They never expected the turret to outlive them. But it did. Its DNA carried forward into post-war gun systems. It influenced turret design on later bombers. It inspired fire control systems on Cold War aircraft. And, in subtle ways, it contributed to the lineage that produced airborne gunships decades later. But none of that mattered to the crews flying in 1944 and 1945. The turret's influence was immediate, visceral, life-saving. Every time a German fighter broke off a frontal run, every time a cannon shell passed wide instead of tearing through the cockpit, every time a bomber limped home with its crew intact, that was the turret's legacy being written in real time. Even the skeptics converted. Pilots who had once mocked the turret as a gimmick began leaning forward in their seats to watch it work. Bombardiers who once dreaded their position now felt pride and responsibility. They weren't just dropping bombs, they were defending the tip of the spear. One bombardier summed it up perfectly after his 25th mission. "I used to feel like the war was happening to me. Now I feel like I'm part of the reason we're winning it." For all its success, the Chin turret's influence wasn't something the bomber crews talked about in grand strategic terms. They didn't quote statistics or praise the engineering behind it. They didn't think about how it affected the macro-level shape of the air war. The men of the 8th Air Force judged the turret with a far simpler metric. Did we make it back? Day after day, mission after mission, the turret answered that question with a silent, unwavering yes. Not always. Not for everyone. The war was still a meat grinder, and the sky over Germany was still the most dangerous place on Earth. But the improvement was undeniable. Crews that might once have been torn apart during the opening minutes of a mission were now surviving long enough for escorts to arrive, long enough for formation firepower to build, long enough to drop their bombs and turn for home. And sometimes, surviving long enough was all that mattered. On one mission over Leipzig, a B-17G from the 390th Bomb Group took a direct hit to its No. 3 engine just after crossing the coast. The propeller tore free. The cowling peeled away like paper. Flames shot out from the wing root, trailing behind the aircraft like a meteor's tail. Normally, this would have been a death sentence. A crippled bomber was easy prey for German fighters. But when the 190s lined up for their predictable head-on pass, the bombardiers swung the Chin turret and fired short, measured bursts. The fighters broke off. They didn't try again. The bomber limped home on 3 engines and bellied in on an English runway. Every crewman survived. In the debrief, the pilot credited the Chin turret without hesitation. "They were coming right for us," he said. But the moment they saw the turret tracking them, they got spooked. They turned away. "I swear it saved us." Stories like that piled up by the hundreds. Some were dramatic, others barely noticeable. A turret that forced a German pilot to make a slightly wider approach. A burst that convinced a pair of 109s to dive away early. A tracking motion that signaled to an enemy squadron that the bomber wasn't as vulnerable as they expected. 1,000 small advantages, invisible in isolation, but decisive in aggregate. But perhaps the most extraordinary part of the turret's story is how close it came to being forgotten. The YB-40 program had been dismissed almost instantly after its failure. Its airframes were stripped for parts. Its name was omitted from many histories. Even internal memos referred to it as the escort bomber experiment, as if its designation were something to be ashamed of. In the rush to celebrate the success of the B-17G, almost no one mentioned that its iconic chin turret had been born inside the belly of a failed design. The generals preferred clean victories, neat innovations, success without the messy middle. But war is not a place where ideas emerge fully formed. War is a place where prototypes break, where concepts collapse, where failures outnumber successes 100 to 1. And yet, buried in those failures, something invaluable can be found, if someone bothers to look for it. The YB-40 wasn't just a failed aircraft, it was a crucible, a proving ground, a test bed in the truest sense. It tried ideas no other program dared attempt. It pushed the limits of what a bomber could carry, what a turret could do, what a defensive system could look like. And though almost all of its innovations died with it, the chin turret survived. That survival mattered more than anyone could have imagined. Because while the turret protected bomber crews, it also protected something else, the future of the daylight bombing strategy itself. By late 1943, the viability of that strategy was in doubt. Losses were too high, morale was too low, the Luftwaffe was too strong. The bomber force was on the brink of collapse. Without the chin turret, the 8th Air Force might have been forced to abandon daylight bombing entirely, retreat to nighttime operations, or drastically reduce mission frequency. Any of those outcomes would have reshaped the war. Daylight bombing wasn't just a tactical preference. It was central to the Allied goal of precision destruction, destroying ball-bearing plants, fuel refineries, transportation hubs, and chemical works with pinpoint accuracy. Nighttime raids, though powerful, lacked that precision. They punished cities, but often missed strategic targets. The Allies needed daylight visibility, and they needed bombers that could survive long enough to deliver on it. The chin turret gave them that survival window. It kept losses within the fragile thresholds the 8th Air Force could sustain. It allowed the strategic bombing campaign to continue uninterrupted until the arrival of long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang, which tipped the balance permanently. One intelligence officer later wrote, "Without the B-17G fielding in numbers when it did, the daylight offensive would have collapsed before the P-51 could save it." In that sense, the turret didn't just protect aircraft. It protected strategy. It protected momentum. It protected the idea that precision bombing could work. And as the 8th Air Force leaned harder into its mission, the effect became unmistakable. Factories that had once produced thousands of German aircraft per year fell silent. Oil refineries were reduced to twisted landscapes of steel skeletons and burning pits. Rail networks slowed to a crawl. The Luftwaffe began running on fumes, literally, unable to fuel more than a fraction of its fighter force. Pilots were grounded, not due to lack of aircraft, but due to lack of gasoline. In the cold logic of total war, the chin turret helped deliver that outcome. The reduced bomber losses meant more missions, more bombs on target, more pressure on the German industrial machine. And the cumulative effect was devastating. Yet the turret's contribution isn't just found in strategic graphs or mission counts. It is found in the memories of the men who flew, the letters they wrote home, the families who received news that their sons had survived another day because a German fighter broke off too early. It is found in the diaries of pilots who wrote that they owed their lives to a spinning dome of metal. It is found in the photos of crews standing proudly beside their aircraft, some with hands resting on the turret as if it were a treasured mascot. It is found in the thousands of B-17s that returned with shattered engines, shot-out control surfaces and broken wings, but intact noses. It is found in every life extended long enough to see victory. The turret wasn't beautiful. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't have the sleek lines of a fighter or the dramatic profile of a bomber's tail. But it worked. Faithfully. Relentlessly. Quietly. And in war, quiet brilliance often saves more lives than loud heroics. When the war finally tilted decisively in favor of the Allies, and the once invincible Luftwaffe lay cracked and exhausted across the skies of a collapsing Reich, the bomber crews who had survived long enough to see this turning point began to reflect on their journeys. They remembered the long, freezing missions where oxygen systems froze solid. They remembered engines tearing free, sudden flashes of fire in the wing, the wrenching spiral of a bomber breaking apart, the hollow feeling of seeing another aircraft disappear into a cloud of smoke or flame. They remembered friends lost not to flak or collisions or mechanical failure, but to the terrifying, unstoppable force of frontal attacks. And they remembered the moment those attacks began to fail, The chin turret didn't make the skies safe. Nothing did. But it made them survivable long enough for the tide to turn. That was its gift to history. A gift wrapped inside a project that had been labeled a failure by nearly everyone who touched it. When crews returned home after the war, they tried to explain what it had felt like to be on the receiving end of a head-on attack, and how different the world became once the B-17G arrived. But their families, friends, and even news reporters couldn't fully understand. Words couldn't capture the sensation of staring down a fighter, racing at you faster than the human brain can properly process. Words couldn't convey the cold, the noise, the vibration, the scent of cordite, the shake of the airframe as 50 caliber guns opened fire inches from your knees. Some tried to put it in simpler terms. Before the turret, you were prey. After the turret, you were a threat. Others used darker metaphors. Before the turret, hell came straight at you. After the turret, hell hesitated. But even these descriptions fell short. The truth was more complex. The chin turret didn't just change the bomber, it changed the men who flew it. It gave them a sense of agency in a place where agency was often impossible. It transformed the role of the bombardier from passive observer to active defender. It allowed crews to fight back at the moment they once felt most helpless. That emotional shift matters. It matters in every war, in every generation. Because soldiers don't just fight with weapons, they fight with belief. Belief in their tools, belief in their training, belief in the men beside them. And when belief is shattered, no amount of armor or firepower can compensate. The chin turret restored belief. As victory approached in Europe, the B-17G formations kept flying. They bombed transportation corridors, industrial centers, oil plants, and rail yards. They smashed what remained of Germany's war-making capacity. But by early 1945, their missions were different. The skies were thinner with enemy fighters. The flak batteries were weaker and less disciplined. The bomber streams flew deeper, stayed longer, hit harder. The chin turret still tracked the sky with its quiet electric motors. But now it did so in a world where its greatest enemy was fading into memory. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm was no longer the well-trained, fearsome force it had been in 1943. Many pilots were barely old enough to shave. They flew outdated aircraft, lacking fuel, lacking training, lacking the confidence to execute the head-on attacks that once defined Luftwaffe doctrine. Some tried anyway. A few desperate German pilots pressed their attacks in the closing months of the war, hurtling toward the bomber streams with grim determination. But even these final assaults were often cut short by the turret's relentless tracking, its precise bursts, its ability to kill even the bravest aggressors in the most dangerous seconds of the attack run. The end of the air war over Europe confirmed what the analysts had predicted months earlier. The chin turret had saved thousands of lives, not theoretically, not statistically, but tangibly, crewman by crewman, mission by mission. The number most historians reference is 2,300 airmen saved from frontal attack deaths. But the unofficial number may be higher. Survivability rose so rapidly, so consistently, that the true impact might never be known. When the war ended and the B-17s began their long journey back to the United States for disposal, storage, or transfer, many crewmen lingered near their aircraft. They walked slowly down the length of the fuselage, touching the metal as if trying to transfer memories into steel. They placed hands on bullet holes, on patched aluminum, on the smooth dome of the chin turret. Some took photos with it. Some wrote their names on it. Some whispered quiet thanks. One bombardier from the 100th Bomb Group reportedly stayed behind after his crew boarded the truck that would take them to the transport home. He placed his hand on the turret and said, "You did your part. You got us home." That's all any of us could ask. He didn't say it for effect. He said it because in war, gratitude often manifests in quiet moments, gestures not recorded in official documents. Once the fortresses were retired, the turret's legacy slipped into an uncomfortable space, important but uncelebrated, crucial but unglamorous. The YB-40, its parent project, remained a footnote. The B-17G itself became the symbol of the bomber offensive, overshadowing the specific innovations that made it lethal and survivable. The P-51 Mustang became the darling of post-war nostalgia. The chin turret? It became just another line in a technical manual. But history has a way of rediscovering the pieces that mattered most. And today, aviation historians are beginning to recognize the turret for what it was, a tiny revolution in steel and electric motors. Its influence is found not only in the outcome of the war, but in the evolution of aerial combat. The concept of forward-facing, pilot, or bombardier-controlled turrets shaped the development of post-war bombers. Power-assisted fire control made its way into Korean War aircraft, then into Cold War bombers, then into airborne gunships. The idea that a large aircraft could defend its forward arc effectively was no longer unthinkable. But even that legacy doesn't fully capture what the turret accomplished. Its greatest achievement wasn't technological. It was human. It extended lives. It gave men a fighting chance. It allowed friendships to endure, letters to be written, families to stay whole. And all of it emerged from a failure. A $5.6 million failed escort bomber that couldn't do the one thing it was designed to do. The YB-40 never escorted anything to the target. It never fulfilled its mission. But something inside it did. War rarely rewards perfection. It rewards persistence, adaptation, improvisation. It rewards the willingness to salvage brilliance from disappointment. The Chin turret was exactly that. Brilliance salvaged from disappointment. A weapon born from a mistake, perfected by necessity, and remembered by the men whose lives it saved. And as long as the history of the air war over Europe is told, not in numbers, but in the beating human hearts behind every mission, the Chin turret's legacy will endure, not as an accessory, not as an upgrade, but as one of the silent heroes of the sky.